unshakable loyalty, I think rooted in suspicion and superstition. It's a fear of leaving the group behind. That is one of the characteristics of all cults. But the distinctive doctrines of Seventh-day Adventism are where the movement's most sinister effects are seen, as you might detect from my brief historical overview. The dogmas of this movement are pretty subject to individual interpretation, although Ellen White is revered as a prophetess, and though she is, without controversy, the chief architect of the denomination's dogmas, no one really believes everything Ellen White said. Nobody really does. She made countless ridiculous pronouncements about health and clothing and diet and quack medicine. She said, for example, that eating butter, eggs, and meat would keep your prayers from going high. She forbade the use of tea and coffee, pickles, mustard, pepper, and cinnamon. She must have been a lousy cook. But she was either dishonest or totally inconsistent. She said in one place, quote, "No butter or flesh meats of any kind come on my table. Cake is seldom found there." And then just a year later, she wrote in a letter to her family, "We had a quarter of venison cooked and stuffing. It was as tender as chicken. We all enjoyed it very much." How do you reconcile that? About 5 years after that, she wrote this, quote, "2 years ago, I came to the conclusion that there was danger in using the flesh of dead animals, and since then I have not used meat at all. It's never placed on my table." But then she went on to describe eating fish, drinking beef broth, cooking with chicken broth, and devouring oysters. I've said already this weekend, I don't understand that, frankly. If I were deprived of meat for months and starved for some meat to get my teeth in, I think oysters would be the last thing I would choose. You could practically drink them through a drinking straw. I want something my teeth would fit into. Just a decade or so after all of that, she declared without qualification, she said, "I do not preach one thing and practice another. I do not present to my hearers rules of life for them to follow while I make an exception in my own case." But then 3 years after that, her secretary, Fanny Bolton, described an incident where she got separated from Mrs. White in a train depot, and she wrote this, quote, "Elder Starr hunted around till he found her behind a screen in the restaurant, very gratified by eating big white raw oysters with vinegar, pepper, and salt." The secretary was understandably confused and disillusioned, and she wrote this, quote, "I kept thinking in my heart, what does this mean? What has God said? How does she dare eat these abominations?" On the cars out, she's still writing, the secretary, "On the cars out to California, W.C. White," that's her son, "came into the train with a great thick piece of bloody beefsteak spread out on brown paper, and he bore it through the tourist car on his own 2 hands. Sarah McCurfinter, who is now with Ellen White as her attendant, cooked it on a small oil stove, and everyone ate of it, except myself and Marion Davis, who I found out afterwards was more the author of the books that purported to be Sister White's than she was herself." That's her secretary, becoming disillusioned as she sees so much hypocrisy. And if that eyewitness testimony is true, and there's no reason to doubt it, it seems clear, doesn't it, that Mrs. White was a thoroughgoing phony. No one today would regard most of Mrs. White's medical advice as anything other than the typical superstitions of the health nuts of that era. But her ideas about diet and healthy living nevertheless left a mark permanently on the denomination. And that's why so many Adventists today are vegetarians and health food aficionados and practitioners of alternative medicines and purveyors of holistic health fads. There is a document online with this curious title, quote, "A History of Seventh-day Adventist Work with Soy Foods, Vegetarianism, Meat Alternatives, Wheat Gluten, Dietary Fiber, and Peanut Butter." And all of that is deeply rooted in Adventism's hopeless entanglement in Old Testament ceremonial and dietary laws. It is an arbitrary and highly selective application of Moses' law, but it is a close modern equivalent of the Galatian heresy. Remember, the Apostle Paul had that very error in mind in the verses I read yesterday from Galatians 1, verses 8 and 9, where he says, even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel other than the one that you've heard, let him be accursed. In other words, Paul is saying this is damnable heresy. It's not an incidental error. It's not a second-level doctrine. This is the rankest form of legalism, and virtually every significant doctrinal error found in the Seventh Day Adventist system is in some way or another derived from this legalistic tendency. Now, I want to shift gears at this point because